We're going to begin our session in about 2 minutes. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for our panelists. Welcome to the second session on key issues in college football. As a reminder, this session is live streamed, so panelists and commission members, please remember to use the microphones when speaking. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to provide just a little background on the issues. College football continues to be the biggest engine driving the finances of college sports. Growing health and safety concerns have spurred the recent adoption of practice guidelines, concussion protocols, and changes to competition rules, all aimed at increasing the protections for college football athletes. Debates and lawsuits about the current structure of player benefits persist, while spending continues to escalate in facility enhancements and coaching and administrative support staffs. At our May meeting, the Knight Commission urged the College Football Playoff to invest some of its revenue for the first time in national initiatives supporting the health and safety of football players and in programs to increase diversity among football coaches. Also, in past reports, the Knight Commission has recommended reining in escalating expenses like those dedicated to the growing number of non-coaching personnel. Today, we're going to hear from experts about these football-related issues. The extensive bios and accomplishments for the panelists are provided in our meeting materials. I'll now introduce them in the order they will provide their opening remarks. Ray Anderson, Vice President for University Athletics and Athletics Director, Arizona State University. Steve Brolio, Director, Neurotrauma Research Laboratory and Associate Professor of Kinesiology, University of Michigan, and the CARE Consortium Co-Principal Investigator. Ed Cunningham, film and TV producer, former football analyst for ABC and ESPN, and former NFL and college football player. Bob Gardner, Executive Director, National Federation of State High School Associations. And Nancy Armour, sports columnist, USA Today. Thank you all for being with us. After Nancy, who will be the final panelist to give remarks, completes her statements, we'll open the floor for questions from the commissioners. Ray Anderson, please begin.
Good morning, everyone, and I am delighted for the opportunity to join you and participate in the discussion. I come to you as a fairly new athletic director. I was in the professional ranks for a number of years. I'm in my fourth season, and I call it season because we start with football. That's why we're here. As the athletic director at Arizona State, prior to that, I had 8 years in the league office as the executive vice president of football operations, originally hired to that position by Commissioner Tagliabue, and I thank him for that. And prior to that, I worked for the Atlanta Falcons in administration. Prior to that, I was an agent for professional athletes and coaches for a number of years. And so I also sit here as a member of the NCAA Football Oversight Committee. And recently we formed an NCAA Football Competition Committee at the behest of Commissioner Emmert, and I am the chair of that committee. So I come to you 4 years at the collegiate level. Prior to that, I was in a private entity, i.e. the NFL primarily, and before that, I was an agent for players and coaches, so I've been around football in particular for a while. I've been tasked with talking about some of the pressing issues in college football. And certainly one of the most pressing is the erosion of participation in the sport at the youth and high school level, primarily driven by the concussion problem, the fact that the primary influencers of whether youth folks will participate in tackle football are the mothers. And I think the numbers at all levels indicate a troubling trend downward, and therefore we are tasked with the formidable problem of how do you, in fact, make the game safer. And it's not just concussions, but other health and safety concerns. And so it's really incumbent on the NCAA, on the NFL, on the National Football Foundation to, in fact, engage and advance research and development that will convince influencers that the game of tackle football is something that they should allow their sons to do. And so we need to continue, as there is ongoing now, significant research and development into safety technology for helmets, be it sensors or mouth guards that provide biomarkers that will enable you contemporaneously to determine if there's been a concussive event, shoulder pad technology, anything and everything we can do to advance education about concussion in particular, return to play protocols, certification at all levels of folks who will be able to help those coaching and administering the game that in fact safety, particularly neck and head injury type events are first and foremost. So a lot of that research is underway. For instance, at Arizona State for 3 years, we participated with our football team in a joint study with TGen and the Barrow Institute and Riddell Helmets to, in fact, have our players baseline tested in the first instance, and then collection of blood, urine, and saliva to be able to determine if, in fact, we could get to the point where you could have biomarkers that during the course of a game, if there was a concussive event, that you would have the technology, the mechanism to determine that immediately and pull that player from play. Those things are ongoing. So Other concerns about participation was mentioned before, the time demands, which is another way of saying specialization at the youth sports. Traveling teams whereby you only get to play one sport if you're a potential elite athlete and are allowed to play football, basketball, baseball, track and field, as some of us in this room did when we were coming up. Those are pressures on the participation levels. So that is a real concern for us, and we need to address it. I'm sure Bob Gardner and others associated with high school football have some thoughts on that as well. Also very key for us is rules changes. The NCAA Rules Committee and the Competition Committee are looking very, very robustly at particularly the targeting rule. Any hit head, neck area with the helmet, shoulder, or forearm is targeting. And we have projected that this year the targeting numbers are going to be higher than ever. We're projecting 200-plus targeting penalties because there's a real emphasis on enforcing that rule. And there's some folks who will outcry that it is too harsh, it is unfair, it is penal when players are immediately ejected for targeting. And what we have to explain is the philosophy used to be we're going to err on the side of player safety. The philosophy now very emphatically is we are going to aggressively enforce the rules to make sure we are protecting and advancing player safety. So if the unintended consequences of that are that a player gets ejected or there's a harsh outcome because one of your best players has been taken off the field, that is not going to change the determination that we have to aggressively protect and therefore hopefully produce an environment where the culture, the coaches and the players just are going to stay away from that play. Because the consequences immediately for ejection in a college football game are real. And very frankly, there's some thought that perhaps the NFL will look at targeting rule as something that should be adopted there. That will be for them to determine, but I know that discussion is going on. The one thing we are convinced of and are really adamant about at the NCAA level is that the science and the data must lead the discussion to enhance these protections. It can't be competitive nature of coaches and athletic directors and others, but in fact, the medical data and the science must lead us and direct us into any potential rule changes. So again, the NCAA and the NFL Competition Committee are collaborating on sharing data to try to further our health and safety work. We've done that, frankly, for years. We continue to do it at a higher level because we've got to advance this. And it's not just head and neck safety. It's shoes. It's thigh pads. It's all the things that are supposed to protect that sometimes people lose sight of. We're working collaboratively on that to make the game as safely as we can. Another concern we have and we're dealing with is the third-party camps and clinics. It was alluded to by President Emmert, essentially having non-scholastic groups kind of taking over the sport. The equivalent in football is the 7-on-7. The camps and clinics run by third parties and handlers whereby the temptations to get away from compliance and really what's doing in the best interest of these players and their families. And so we're really looking at controlling how camps and clinics are run so that we don't get our players in harm's way, our families in harm's way. And it's not just because the Autonomy 5 schools are concerned about themselves. In fact, they're concerned about the overall direction of the game when you have outside influencers, third-party handlers involved. Very frankly, we don't want to have football get as deep into trouble as we have, very frankly, with the AAU basketball. And so that's very much on our radar. So the Competition Committee and the Football Oversight Committee have taken a strong look at how we can intercede and cut off these camps and clinics that tended to go in the wrong direction. We're working hard on that. Another thing we're certainly concerned about, and it's been mentioned here, is the professionalization threat to collegiate athletics and the potential impact, very frankly, that will have on non-revenue sports. So if football and basketball players primarily become employees or professionalized, then that will have a detrimental effect on the non-revenue sports. And do we want to go, as Mark mentioned, more toward the European model where you're not connected to a college, but you're a club team, you're a governance, you're a governing body team? We suggest that that is not a good thing. We're very adamant against professionalization because if there's one thing we do know is that our non-revenue sports, i.e. our Olympic sports, are important to us. And if you professionalize, then those sports, those non-revenue sports, the Olympic sports, they will start falling away from our campuses. And what effect does that have on our ability to field really competitive Olympic teams in the other sports? And so one of the real concerns is that the professionalization would lead us to fewer Olympic sports on campus. We think that would be a disservice. We prefer not to have that model, and so we're very cautious about anything that would lead us to professionalizing collegiate athletics. We don't believe they're employees. Great arguments about all the wonderful incremental value a college scholarship and an athletic opportunity at the collegiate level brings you. We happen to believe that those things combined with all the others should not lead us to professionalization. And then finally, we talked a little bit about the rising cost of college athletics, and it is very true. The facilities, the coaching salaries, the coaching sizes, the consultant, Mrs. Cartwright, that we talk about, that there's some schools that have more consultants than they do students, I think. And it's very concerning because of those costs. And there's an arms race in a lot of the Autonomy 5 institutions. The pressure on recruiting and providing facilities that allow you to recruit at the highest level, that's real. And it's certainly something we've got to keep our eye on. I know at our institution, for us to stay up with all the other fabulous facilities that have popped up in the last few years in the Pac-12 conference, it's real. And so we're having to deal with that, hopefully in an intelligent way, but those pressures are absolutely there. And then finally, we had some discussion on the transfer rules. There's a lot to be done there, but certainly the philosophy we believe in is that, and President alluded to it, if a transfer student, particularly a graduate student, has fulfilled his or her obligations and have graduated either early or on time, the thought that you would prohibit that person from freely going to an institution of his or her choice is very problematic. There's a lot of work to be done, but I think there's a full understanding that once you have fulfilled those academic requirements, you should have the freedom of movement unencumbered by your coach worried about you might transfer to a university against which he or she would then have to compete. If you've done what you've done and supposed to have done as a student athlete, then you should have that freedom of movement unencumbered. And so those are some of the things, and there are a litany of them that we are dealing with on the college football front. I'm delighted to be part of the effort for hopefully positive change, and I'll look forward to entertaining any questions afterward as appropriate.
Thank you, Ray. You have indeed laid out quite a litany, and I'm sure people will want to come back to you with questions. We'll move now to Steve.
Thank you, and thank you to the committee for allowing me to come and speak today. It's truly an honor to be here. I'm happy I don't have Mr. Anderson's job. I deal with just concussion, not the 95 other things that he rattled off. As was said earlier, my name is Steve Broly. I'm on faculty at the University of Michigan. I'm one of the 3 primary investigators on the CARE Consortium, along with Tom McAllister at Indiana University and Mike McCrae at the Medical College of Wisconsin. The project is funded by the NCAA and the Department of Defense for the last 3 years. Some of you may be wondering why the Department of Defense and the NCAA partnered with each other. in large part because the NCAA student athlete and the military cadet on the academies, at the academies, and then the soldier once they leave are very similar. They are young, 18 to 25 years old. They push themselves to the absolute edge of excellence, both mentally and physically. And then the mechanism for traumatic brain injury or concussion is virtually identical between the two groups. So while the two most recent conflicts have drawn attention to explosions and blast injury, about 85% of concussions that occur in the military occur in garrison and non-combat situations. So the biomechanical properties of that injury are similar to the sporting situation. In 2013, the fall of 2013, actually in Washington, D.C., the NCAA and the DoD hosted a panel to understand or to identify what the gaps were in the scientific literature surrounding concussion, and this is a field that I've been involved with now for approximately 20 years. And even sitting at that panel, it was quite amazing to me what we discussed, and it was all absolutely correct. The first and foremost was we do not understand the natural history of concussion, meaning if someone has a concussion, how long does it take for them to recover? Is this the same profile? How long does it take for them to recover in the short term? How long in the long term? Is it the same profile for a female cross-country runner as it is for a male football player? Someone from a high socioeconomic background and a low socioeconomic background, different races, different genders. We do not understand this. What domains do these individuals display as functionally impaired at the time of injury? Historically, we've looked at symptoms, we've looked at balance, we've looked at cognitive functioning. There's new emerging evidence to suggest that eye function, verbal processing, all those may also play a role in this, and we don't have a full grasp of it. Are all sport-related concussions the same? I understand that we are here to talk about football. This is not a football-only problem. This is not a male-only problem. This is males and females. This is all sports. Football, which gets the most attention because it is the biggest and the baddest and it has the highest participation rate, actually has the fourth highest concussion rate of NCAA sports. Wrestling is number one, men's ice hockey, women's ice hockey, which is a non-contact sport by definition, football is number 4, and then women's soccer, men's soccer. We need to talk about more than just football. This is not just a football problem. We also need to understand the neurobiology of concussion. Historically, we have evaluated these injuries on clinical performance or functional performance. How well do you remember a series of words, a list of pictures or series of pictures? What's your reaction time? What's your balance like? What symptoms do you tell me about? We have come a long way since I started in this field. MRI, DTI, MRS, tau protein deposits in the brain, all of these things are new technologies that we can use and employ to help us understand what's going on inside the brain at a cellular level and whether or not that is the true marker of recovery or not. So with that, the NCAA and the DoD, they launched the Grand Alliance, they joined in a Grand Alliance. They launched or funded the Concussion Assessment Research and Education Consortium. This is the project I'm helping to lead. The project involves 3 cores, if you will. One being the administration core, which is run by Tom McAllister out of Indiana University. Tom and his group, they handled the budgets, they handled the human subjects regulations, which we have 30 sites across the country, and the military is involved, so you can imagine the military likes their paperwork, and Tom handles that for us, him and his team. They handle all of the data management, the biostatistics, and then as we collect blood samples and saliva samples from individuals, they store and process those as well. I run the clinical study core out of the University of Michigan. Our job is to understand the clinical performance that people display post-injury with up to 6 months post-injury. And then Mike McRae runs the advanced research core at the Medical College of Wisconsin. He gets all the fun gizmos and gadgets. He gets helmet sensors. In the football athletes, we tried desperately to find additional sensors for lacrosse and wrestling and soccer and ice hockey, but there is no good sensor available for those sports. It's only in football at this time. He gets the fun imaging tools, he gets the MRIs, he gets the DTIs, he gets the MRSs. And then he also does the blood biomarkers. Ray and his team at Arizona are doing, sounds like they're doing similar work where we are doing blood draws in a subset of our population, our participants, immediately post-injury, and then moving out at 5 different time points to understand what blood markers, what the profile of these blood markers are post-injury, and can we use that as a diagnostic and a return-to-play tool. As I mentioned, the project's been going for a little over 3 years now. I'm happy to report that we have met or exceeded all of our targeted goals. We have enrolled 37,000 student athletes and service academy cadets to date, actually as of September. I would note that at the 4 service academies, it is not just the varsity level athlete on those campuses. We get every cadet on campus, or every cadet on campus is eligible to participate. Overwhelmingly, across all 30 of our sites, we have about a 90% participation rate in the study. The student athletes, the service academy cadets are begging to take part. They want to contribute to the science. They want to understand. We are not just a male study. We have 40% enrollment in our study from females. Our cadet population makes up about 40%. And then football is the single largest sport at about 14% participation. We have been, fortunate or not, capture about 2,500 concussions in the 3-year period. This is approximately 100-fold what the average concussion study would do prior to this time point. Somewhere in the neighborhood of a good study would be 25, a great study would be 30, and we have 2,500 injuries that we can analyze. Within that subset of injuries, we have about 40% female representation. About 20% come from our cadets, and about 23% come from football. I just want to run through, there's a lot of data in here. We have like 65 million data points. I'm not going to run through all of them. It'd be pretty boring, I think. I do want to talk about just some of the quick highlights that we've been able to extract from the data set. You can imagine, as well, as the data rolls in, we try to clean it in real time and have it available for analysis. We're probably 6 to 8 months. It takes about 6 to 8 months for us to actually get a data set to the point where we can analyze it and provide good information for people. In football, since we're talking about football today, about 70% of all football concussions occur during practice situations, 30% during games. I think when we talk about how do we make the game safer, I think talking about banning the game is absurd. I think we talk about how to make the game safer, and there's a number of reasons I feel that way. I think practices are the #1 place to focus. We can change practice rules easily. Changing game rules becomes much more complex. 50% of football practices, 50% of football practice concussions in football occur during the month of August. This is preseason. So half of your practice, about 35% of all concussions in football occur in the 3 to 4 week span in August. And I think this is largely the impetus for the change in the 2-a-day contact rules that were made this year. I think the idea of we're going to get rid of a certain number of 2-a-day practices and then add on more single-day practices is a little misguided, but we'll see what the data say in the spring coming up. Concussion is incredibly difficult to diagnose. I'm a certified athletic trainer by trade. That's what I started with. Identifying that individual in real time that has a concussion or does not have a concussion for that matter is incredibly complex. We didn't quite understand why. Initially, we thought the kids are lying to us. 50% of the kids are going to not report their concussion because they don't want to be pulled from play, they don't want to let teammates down, may not want to lose the scholarship. It turns out that 30% of them do not have an immediate onset of symptoms. They are struck, they continue playing for approximately 30 minutes, and then 30 minutes after the game or the practice ends, that's when symptoms set on. They don't even know that they are injured. A little bit off topic here, I was at a competitive event, not a football game, about a month or so ago, and it was a bicycle race. An individual crashed. I was there at the time it happened. I started an evaluation to help him. He was completely fine, and then within 30 minutes after the injury, he asked me 4 times what happened after being able to recall immediately afterwards. It is an evolving injury. It is very difficult. It can be very difficult to diagnose in real time. On top of that, only about 6% of individuals with concussion have a loss of consciousness. It used to be, we would say, you had to have a loss of consciousness to have a concussion, and we know that that's not true anymore. 6% is lower than what's been reported in the literature in the past, largely, I would say, because we are capturing more injury. We're more sensitive to it, and we're diagnosing more quickly because our ability to do so is better. Return to play time following injury is approximately 14 days, and this includes the time from injury until when the individual reports they're asymptomatic. They no longer have concussion-related symptoms. They perform normally on a neurocognitive evaluation and a balance evaluation, and then a standardized 5-day return-to-play protocol. That being said, about 20% of individuals continue to display symptoms past 1 month. We do not have a clear grasp as to why 1/5 of our student athletes and military service academy cadets continue to have symptoms this long. This is one of the things we're looking into, and we're hoping that we can explore not only to identify these individuals, but how to treat them and get them back quicker and safely, for that matter. The 14-day return to play period is approximately 8 days longer than it was about 20 years ago. There has been a definite shift in how we manage the injury. There's some data from the original NCAA study that was performed in the late 1990s, early 2000s, which would indicate that individuals would return to play either the day they were symptomatic, or the day they were asymptomatic, or the next day. And because of that, 80% of repeat concussions occurred within the first 10 days. We are now down to virtually 0. I think we had 1 out of 250 repeat concussions in the first 10 days. That's just some quick findings. I just want to let people know that all of the data we are collecting, we are uploading into an NIH and Department of Defense funded database. It's called FITBR, the Federal Interagency Traumatic Brain Injury Research System. All of these data will become publicly available. Everything is de-identified. We take out all the primary health information, so you can't identify athletes. We will do our best to analyze all of these data, but of course we know our team is not going to be able to do everything. We will open it up to everybody, to the public, to other researchers, so they can complete other analyses, and hopefully we will help resolve this issue or find treatments for this issue as quickly as possible. I've just been given the signal I'm out of time, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Ed, we're ready to move to you. Thank you.
Thanks. My name's Ed Cunningham. Until recently, I was a college football commentator for ABC and ESPN for the better part of 20 years. Before that, I played in the NFL for 5 years, and I played in college at the University of Washington. Thank you, Mr. Emmert. We have 2 Huskies in the house. And I played at a place where we did blend academics and athletics. And so my entire career as a football player, I was challenged to do things off the field. I began producing. I produced my first short film right after college, before I was actually drafted in the NFL. I used my NFL as leverage to get a job as a broadcaster and as a little capital to get started as an independent producer. I've been around the game of football. This is my first fall. I resigned from ESPN in May. This is my first fall without competitive football in my life since 1982. So when I go back that far and I look at the changes that have been made, I want to say thanks, first of all, to the Knight Commission, which has been around since I played in college, and also the NCAA and its member institutions. There have been major improvements for student athletes. There have been, we had kids who couldn't go home during the holidays because they came from poor homes and their scholarship didn't give them enough money to buy a $150 ticket home to Texas. These were heartbreaking times when these kids couldn't work. We couldn't work during the season. So we'd go home for 2 months, and you had to train. You couldn't really get a job, and these kids from these poor families would come back to campus, our buddies, and they couldn't do anything. They couldn't get a pizza. They couldn't buy a new sweater or get a new coat when it was raining in Seattle again. You know, so I thank you for those. I will say to Ray, the NCAA's targeting rule is far superior than the NFL. The NFL is draconian in how they govern this. It is something I studied ad nauseum at ESPN. I trained as an official. I went to learn how they looked at the replays. The college rule is common sense. It has changed behavior. It has changed coaching. And a big improvement is it's changed tackling. Tackling, for the most part, is now head behind or rugby-style tackling. It's almost hard to believe as we sit here. Tackling used to be taught like this. Put your head in front of the running back. Now, some of those guys are as big as David Robinson. I'm not kidding. Some running backs are 260 pounds, and you're telling a kid he's got to put his head in front. And now we've gone to where a lot of schools are teaching head behind. It's more of a rugby tackle. Coaches are talking about less shoulder injuries. A bit of a slower athlete now can make a tackle because you're supposed to be a half a step behind. So now they can play the smart kid who's half a step slow. So we've seen these great strides in the game. But I think for me, this game that I've been around my entire life, I've documented it a million times. I've told a million stories. I've watched it. I've coached it. And it goes to the question Mr. Emmert asked, what are we in the business of? And this sport has people the size of David, the size of me, the size of Len, running into each other at full speed. Steve just told us we have the same concussion issues as the military. That's not by accident. We're doing the same things as the military, right? It's hand-to-hand combat. My fingers don't close because they got ripped apart when I was battling against 350-pound men in the NFL. This is very real stuff. These are kids. And as I sat in my perch at ESPN and you know, you're in that booth and it's a little, you know, you guys sit up there, it's a little like, oh, that's, you know, sort of down there. That's those kids. Go down on that field. Go down on a practice and watch these 320-pound full-grown men beat each other up every day. This is not about concussions. This is just about full body breakdown. And what I think there's two major issues for college sports. And Mark, I want to thank you. Those were some of the most direct, honest comments I've ever heard from anybody this highly associated with college sports. We are at a crossroads. There is absolutely no doubt about it. And the question that you asked that I heard during your speech is, are we okay being a professional sports group? Not our athletes professionals, because I do think there's a way to keep the amateurism around. But it goes to your question, Sarah. There was a headline that asked if Nick Saban's $11 million salary was too low in the USA Today. I printed it out. I put it on my desk. $11 million for a guy to coach football. My college coach used to say football is a game invented by phys ed majors for phys ed majors. He sort of made fun of it. The guy's making $11 million a year, and we're asking, is that too low? What is our value? What are we valuing? Because my question becomes, if they're there just to get a skill and just to prove their value, that's negative competition. That's competition to prove your value. I think as colleges and I think as people of higher thinking or higher learning, let's focus on positive competition, the competition that brings the best out of ourselves. That's what I got in college. That's where I felt, that's why I was impassioned and ready to come and speak at this. I got the whole thing out of college, man. I'm not giving any of it back. And I played for a coach who didn't physically abuse us, didn't emotionally abuse us, required us to expand our horizons. We met with business leaders. We were totally pushed to take advantage of our position in that society, and some of that's just gone. It's just gone. I mean, we have baseball teams that are out of school in early May playing until almost the 4th of July. That's a negative revenue sport, people. Why are we doing it? We're making kids who can't go home. They can't go on holidays. They can't do anything with their family for almost 2 months. Where are we? Well, here's the two issues that I think Mr. Emmert was right. Collectively, it needs to be solved, or the courts are going to solve it for you. Your media rights are shaky. Let's just be honest. The idea that I'm a producer, I produce television, and I produce film. When I deliver a film to a major studio, every contract better be right. Well, you guys know there's some leaky oil on how this stuff is set up. And that amount of revenue makes you a professional sport. I'm not saying it makes your athletes professionals, but you are governing a professional sport. And until you take ownership of that, and I would say enter into a form of collective bargaining. I was in the NFL, Paul, when we did that with the players. We made a great deal. That deal exists today with just a few changes. And it's been really good for the athletes, not just enriching them, giving them a platform, allowing them to do things off the field that they weren't doing before that evolved. And oh, by the way, the value of the NFL for every team has 6x since then. So what is our value? We need to get to the table and start giving more. I know the Knight Commission made a very modest recommendation of how much money from the FBS should go. Let's start there. Just say yes to that. Let's get that money. Let's start looking out for these athletes beyond college. So you have two real issues here, safety and I think a real financial and court concern that if you don't get your act together, you're going to be told to. The Ed O'Bannon case, EA Sports shutting down an entire division because they didn't believe it was legally viable, that's real. That's real. And if you want to get a coalition of presidents together, start talking to them about their media rights. Start talking to them about the revenue based on what they get from places like ESPN and Fox and NBC. Because that can go away by the courts. That can go away. The safety issue, it's a tough one. It's large, high-trained men running into each other at full speed. That's why I went public with my stance. It's why I stepped away from being sort of complicit in the game. At least I felt as an analyst. You sort of have to, draw the audience to the next play. So a kid's getting carted off, and I have to give you analysis of what's going to happen on 3rd and 8. Oh, they're going to go to the tight end here, and I just couldn't do that anymore. You watch an NFL game. How many guys are getting carted off now? So there's 2 major issues here. And I think, Mark, I can't thank you enough for being that direct and that honest. What is your enterprise? Because your enterprise in college athletics is professional. And I think that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Bob?
Good morning. It's my privilege to represent the National Federation of State High School Associations and our member state associations across this country and talk to you a little bit about the status of high school football in America. I give you a perspective from starting as a teacher, coach, to a school administrator, 15 years in a state athletic association office, and now the past 18 years in our national office. The state of high school football overall in this country remains strong. Our participation numbers for this year are not yet in, so I'll look at and evaluate a little bit for you the numbers of the past year. In 2016, 1,088,863 young people participated in high school football in this country. It is the leading sport in total participation in high school athletics by over 400,000 participants. Yet it ranks 5th in offerings per school in this country. So there's a little bit of a difference in the number of schools who offer football and the participants who do participate. During the past year, 14,099 schools in high schools in our member state associations offered football at the 11-man level. Another 1,358 schools offered football below 11-man, either 9, 8, or 6-man football. That participation number is perhaps better put in perspective when you make some comparisons. That number from 2015 to last year, 2016, dropped by 23,000 participants. When you look at that per school, it's slightly less than 2 per school. At the same time, the sports of cross country grew by a little over 10,000, and the sport of soccer grew by a little over 9,000. So while we're losing some numbers in football, I don't believe we're losing student athletes. They're simply transferring to other sports. We hear an awful lot at the high school level about participation numbers, and that drop connected to all of the publicity about concussions and head trauma. And certainly that's concerning to us at the high school level, just as it is at the collegiate level. But it goes deeper than that. I've just concluded our 8 sectional meetings that we hold every fall, traveling to each of the 8 sections of the country, meeting with the leadership of our respective state associations. The universal theme that we've heard this year throughout the country is that our smaller schools are getting smaller. And anecdotally, a number of small schools that used to field 11-man football teams in those states where they have the option are switching to 9, 8, or 6-man football to keep programs alive. In addition to that, we are concerned about the safety of the sport. We've seen that the big drop in numbers reported at the youth level in football perhaps is just now hitting our level at the high school. And so we'll be looking anxiously at the numbers this fall to see where we arrive. The all-time high for participation in high school football in this country occurred in 2008. That's approximately almost 10 years ago or a decade ago. And that number drop now would yield about 3.5 students per each high school offering the state of football. High school football revenue and attendance figures for our respective state associations are generally good, with the exception of some of our urban areas. That pays the bill at the high school level in many instances just as it does at the collegiate level. Football revenue supports other sports at high schools as well, and that revenue is extremely important. It's our position that our programs probably have less risk than ever before. We're doing a better job with education. We're doing a better job managing the risk to student athletes. There are more trainers, though not at every school. We are doing an important work with telemedicine in those rural areas that don't have sideline professionals available for their contests. And so we have seen an increased focus on risk minimization and managing the health of the student athlete and providing access to professionals. In 2014, the NFHS convened a task force of medical experts to make recommendations to minimizing concussion risk and head trauma. State associations across this country have implemented those recommendations with good results. We are now in our 13th year of collecting data on injuries through an online reporting system done by certified athletic trainers managed through the University of Colorado School of Public Health. They are the data collectors. Concussion rates in high school football rose every year from 2005 to 2014. Now, those concussion rates at practices are beginning to drop. They dropped last year as new practice protocols appear to be producing the desired results. The national study was also supported by state studies in the states of Wisconsin and Michigan, showing positive results following the changes to practice guidelines. These new protocols have limited contact to no more than 30 minutes in a practice per day, participating in only one contact practice per day, no back-to-back two-a-day practices at high school level, with an additional particular emphasis focused on having and using emergency action plans. Education remains at the core of the NFHS efforts to reduce risk. We have provided a free online course on concussions that to date over 3,400,000 people, coaches, parents, student athletes have completed. In addition, we introduced this year a concussion course for student athletes that to date over 150,000 students have taken. We are also adding a course on concussions in Spanish. Those are all positive things, but let me now focus a little bit of my allotted time on some of the concerns from the high school community as we work with those students who will play football at the collegiate level. Football recruiting has been primarily through the high school football programs and high school coach. We believe this is the correct model and not the one that currently is in use in many other sports. We must be vigilant regarding evaluation periods that would destroy this model and promote other individuals entering the space for private gain rather than the welfare of the student. Spring and summer 7-on-7 football that Ray alluded to earlier, that has an emphasis on national championships and all-star teams rather than individual improvement under the direction of the high school coach, is dangerous and should not be permitted as this sport goes forward. It provides that avenue for insertion into the recruiting process of unregulated individuals. The high school coach has a responsibility to the student athlete and has supervision, an athletic director, a principal, a superintendent, a school board, and a community looking over his shoulder. In the other model, who supervises? Who regulates? We're hard-pressed to come up with an answer. We understand the need to evaluate prospects for the collegiate coaches, but I would say to you that all our high schools video every contest, and they make it accessible to the collegiate coaches, and it's very inexpensive for everybody. The need for travel and seeing non-school events is simply, in football, not necessary. In a time when both the high schools and colleges provide mandatory acclimatization periods, what are we doing in summer and spring with contact camps and all-star contests who often do not follow the collegiate acclimatization rules and certainly not the high school acclimatization rules? These events should be outlawed. It's not good for the student athlete. Close monitoring of the early signing period just instituted must occur. While we are not opposed in theory, the date selected falls during certain state football playoffs. This is certainly a distraction, and when the high school focus should be on team and not the individual. We are also concerned with the intrusion of football into Friday nights, a night that is traditionally in this country reserved for high school football in much of the nation. We note that of the Autonomy 5 or Power 5 or whatever you're calling it today, only the SEC has refrained from playing on Friday night. High school football is all about community, and the need for community support is large. It brings communities together, and it builds pride. Competing with colleges on Friday night is not necessary, and it's harmful to high school football, and over the long haul will be harmful to collegiate football as well. Finally, there is a growing trend of high school football players who have completed requirements for graduation to leave school at the end of the 7th semester of their senior year to enroll in college early so they can participate in spring practice, thus improving their chances to play as a true freshman. While this falls in bounds, no question about it, it just seems wrong for a young man to miss the final semester of his senior year, the activities associated with that, and to not play perhaps basketball or wrestle or a spring sport. Despite our concerns, the high school community supports the opportunity afforded our student athletes to play this sport. We'll make every attempt to manage risk and believe that young people who play football at every level learn life lessons that make them a better person. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you today.
Thank you, Bob. Nancy, we'll now hear from you.
Good morning. I'm Nancy Armour. I'm a columnist for USA Today Sports. I'm pleased to be here and part of the discussion. I know you've all gotten a lot of great information, and I'm sure you've got questions, so I will try and be brief. This is an interesting time for all of athletics, but college athletics in particular. As the other panelists have mentioned, there are concerns about outside influences on sport, about head trauma and other injuries, and questions about what kind of impact that could have on insurance, liability coverage, and even the future of the sports themselves. And of course, there's the issue of whether college athletes should be paid beyond their scholarships or the true cost of education. This is a debate we've been having for years, if not decades, but it's taken on even greater urgency with all of the money that's been flooding into college athletics in recent years. Between the big TV contracts for the NCAA men's tournament, the college football playoff championship now, and the advent of individual networks for the power conferences, college athletics is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And it's getting harder and harder to argue that players shouldn't be compensating beyond the true cost of their education for the money that they're helping to generate. My colleagues at USA Today Sports keep track of how much football and basketball coaches are paid and publishes its findings each year. as Ed mentioned, we just did our college football coaches package last week, and Nick Saban gets $11 million a year. Now, I'm sure that was the number that jumped out to most people, but what I found noteworthy was that 20 coaches are making more than $4 million a year. In 2014, there were 11 coaches making more than $4 million a year. So in just 3 years, that number has almost doubled. When we did the survey of coaches whose teams made the NCAA men's tournament, there were 5 coaches who were making more than $4 million. 25 were making more than $2 million a year. And the free spending goes beyond salaries. The NCAA is considering a proposal that would limit the size of college football staffs to 30 people. In January, Clemson opened a $55 million football complex that includes a wiffle ball field, a sand volleyball pit, a barber shop, and a wading pool. You can make the argument, as I have, that the exorbitant salaries that coaches are paid and the over-the-top amenities that there are possible because college athletics does not have labor costs. Yes, there are scholarships, but you are not paying the $1 million salaries that you get in the NBA and the NFL. This is not lost on college athletes, and they've become more forceful in asking for a fair share of the money that they're helping to generate. Nigel Hayes, who played in 2 Final Fours for Wisconsin, was outspoken and eloquently so when he was at Madison in pointing out the inequities of the system as it currently exists. We've seen lawsuits that have challenged the NCAA's antitrust status and the definition of amateurism. So far, those lawsuits have had a negligible effect on the NCAA and its schools. But that could change, whether it's with the Jenkins or Alston lawsuits that are currently working their way through the court systems, or another that could be yet to be filed that could lead to a decision that conflicts with O'Bannon. If that would be the case, it could force the Supreme Court to take up the issue, and there's no telling what that could mean then for the NCAA and its schools. There are compelling arguments to make both for and against paying players. I personally am opposed to just cutting checks as if they're already in the NBA or NFL. I think that would open up a thorny list of problems, and as President Emmert mentioned, there is something special and unique in American athletics about college sports. But I think we can all agree that more needs to be done to compensate the athletes for the billions that they are bringing in. It's a matter of figuring out how to do it. In a column I wrote in May, which is, I believe, what led the Knight Commission to ask me to be here today, I proposed some ideas that would actually be fairly simple to adapt, and they wouldn't be overly burdensome to the smaller schools, which is one of the questions that we always have about how this is done. You could pay for athletes' families to accompany them on recruiting trips. You could provide health care beyond graduation. Open a 15-year window in which athletes can come back and finish their degrees or earn additional ones, whether it's at the bachelor level or the graduate level. Pay bonuses upon graduation and use a sliding scale. So if you earn it close to within the 6-year window that the NCAA and the federal government uses to determine graduation rate, you get a higher bonus. Goes down the further away from the 6 years you get. And yes, let students profit off their names, images, and likenesses. One of the questions is always, how do we get this done, or how is this done? The Knight Commission has proposed using some of the money that comes in from the college football playoff to fund medical care. Use some more money to help pay for this. Do the same thing with a percentage from the NCAA tournament contract. I think most coaches, if you talk to them, they agree that there is disparity and that they would be willing to do things to help if they were allowed to. Take a percentage of some of these big contracts. And Ray, as you mentioned that there is the arms race that's going on, slap a tax on these Taj Mahals. If you want to spend $55 million to buy, build this, pay a 0.5% or 1% or whatever it is and put it in a fund for the athletes. Some of the conferences are already trying to address this. The Pac-12 has been one of the leaders. And that's well and good because it is the major conferences where most of this money is coming from. But this is a problem that's endemic to college athletics, not just the marquee schools. And as Ed mentioned, if the schools in the NCAA don't figure it out, it will be figured out for you by the courts. The idea that college athletics is simply an extracurricular activity is outdated. Surveys have shown that these athletes are spending at least 30 hours, sometimes upwards of 40, on their sport. It's the equivalent of a full-time job, and we haven't even gotten to the fact that these are students too. Schools and conferences are reaping extraordinary benefits and results from college athletics, and it's past time, for the athletes to get more of an equitable share. Thank you.
Many thanks to the panel for very thought-provoking ideas, excellent presentations. We'll now hear from commissioners who have questions for any of our panelists? Len, I see you with a look on your face that you want to begin.
I was just trying to get my notes together, particularly after Nancy's presentation. I would agree that, there are some areas where reform could certainly inure to the benefit of student athletes with regard to commercialism, and it should. But my first question is, and I got a couple, who mandates the reform? I mean, when you talk about the courts, right now, these lawsuits are seeking to dilute central authority to make change as opposed to consolidate it. The second thing, when you take a look at these lawsuits, one of the basic things that has kept courts from saying that the NCAA in total at their system, or when I say NCAA, I'm just talking about the membership institutions, not the body itself. But the thing that keeps them alive, if you will, is the recognition of the education mission. Even when Judge Wilkin ordered $5,000 a month, $5,000 a year maximum in trust for the name, image, and likeness, the Ninth Circuit struck it down because it's not related to the education mission. So my point is, I think everybody would agree that reforms can be better. And I think everybody would agree that you shouldn't, well, a lot of people would agree that stroking just a check would, again, obliterate the difference between pro sports and college sports and change that uniqueness of the game. But when we talk about the idea of compensating the athletes, the general public thinks that it's all about giving the check. I mean, I understand that. I mean, last week I was in a couple of debates on that very issue, and we're up against it because the optics are such that everybody looks at the big bad NCAA, which seems to represent all of commercialism in college sports, and then they're exploiting, because of the money that's made, they're exploiting the poor student athlete without recognizing the nuance, where the rights to media rights and television and tickets for all the tournaments, supposedly 96% of that goes back to programs that do exactly what people are asking, paying for parents and families to come to the tournaments, the hardship opportunities that are alleviated by some of the programs that they have, going to academic support, going to a lot of things. Nobody talks about that. When we talk about compensating, nobody says a word about what they've already gotten. And I'm not saying they shouldn't get more. But in the end, my belief is you want to change the salaries and the benefits. If you go and try to do it on an independent basis, if you're the NCAA, you can't do it because you're going to get sued, antitrust. The bottom line is this is the Wild West, give a marshal the authority to clean it up on the condition that they do clean it up. In fact, you make a list of all the things that should inure to the benefit of student athletes and say if you don't utilize this exemption to that end, then you lose it. Then you can die a death by litigation, 1,000 litigation cuts. But again, when we make this argument, I think it's unfair when we don't talk about the absolute benefits that they get. We're feeding into that bigger narrative of Goliath versus David, when in effect there's a lot of complexities in between. So, I mean, it's more of a comment than a question.
I actually think you did have a very interesting point there at the end. What authority? And you mentioned, let's come up with a list. In courts, if you're being sued and you show that you've negotiated with the other side and the court says, yeah, you know what, we think that's fair, you can move past that lawsuit. You can move to a place where you have harmony in the marketplace. There is disharmony in this marketplace. It is not a harmonious marketplace. It's why you have the inefficiencies that showed up through Adidas and these $10,000 payoffs to ruin a kid. And I mentioned collective bargaining, the student athlete is not represented, period.
I don't know
The
about
Knight
that,
Commission, the Knight Commission does a good job, but there is no union, there is no unifying voice to negotiate what their rights are.
But let me ask you a question. Aren't there options? In other words, you want to become a pro basketball player, you can become a pro basketball player coming out of high school. You don't have to go to college if that's what this is about. once you get in, to me, it's not an employee-employer relationship. It's a beneficiary-benefactor relationship.
No, I'm not, the employee-employer thing is such a thorny. I'm more speaking from, I believe there's room at the table to sit around and start to say, all right, what do we need? How does this wealth need to be redistributed to be a little more fair towards the student athlete? I always, I think what the commission is saying and what Nancy said is, make it about long-term care. Make it about things they can have after college to help them get other jobs. The NFLPA the Players Association has done a good job with this thing called the trust. Whereas an ex-player, I can go get education. I can go get health services. These are things that cost a lot of money, and the NFLPA has a lot of money to do that, and so do the schools. So who's the authority? I think it goes back to self-governance. Get everyone in a room, and I know you do it all the time, but say, look, the courts are going to burn it down. I agree with Nancy. I don't think the courts are going to agree with us, Len, that the National Labor Relations Board has already ruled in the Chicago district.
Local.
I understand it's local,
Okay.
but it's a valid opinion,
And the
right?
other,
it's a valid opinion.
But it's not a controlling opinion.
Well,
Point being is that, again, we keep saying that, but how many instances of lawsuits has the court had the opportunity to overturn, and they haven't because they use that one hook, education mission. Now, when you talk about participation,
I don't think that's going to continue in the courts, Len. I think when you sit down and you show the numbers, I don't think the courts are going to continue to give that.
I think the courts have seen it. Even the Ninth Circuit has seen the numbers. I mean, that's what they did in O'Bannon. And they still carved out the education mission. But, I mean, my point is, how many panels, how many committees do student athletes sit on, and are their voices valid, or do they have any power in saying that? And I'm not saying it can't be better, but it exists. And the other thing is,
real quick time out though, Len. Here's a big difference. They're not represented by a litigator. They're not represented by someone who understands media rights. They're not represented by someone who understands their name and likeness rights. Those are really complex issues. Johnny Manziel was worth, $20, $30 million.
What was his left tackle worth?
Well,
that's my point.
No, I understand, but
I agree with that.
But to have a discussion where we get to a middle ground where, maybe a player doesn't get more than another player, maybe it all goes into one pot, they all get the same. The players, the athletes are not represented fairly. They're not.
But
they can sit on the committee, but they're 20-year-old kids studying economics. They're not, people that we would negotiate against when we had to, when I have to negotiate a rights deal.
But it's not really about negotiation. Once again, it is benefactor, beneficiary. You have this set of rules. Once you decide, you forego the option of not going to college. Once you decide to go to college, as a beneficiary, I'm going to accept these benefits. And the benefits have improved. No one can argue they haven't improved.
I agree.
And they probably should improve even quicker. Right now, we're looking at a battleship trying to turn, and, we've got to pare that down to make it more of a destroyer. But the point is, the change has been here. The change is coming. The more pressure people put on with regard to the optics and with regard to the realities, I think even greater change is going to come. But in the end, I think by instituting collective bargaining, doing things that on the periphery look like professional sports, we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're starting to change that whole concept of college sports. And I just think it's a mistake. I do think things like name, image, and likeness, the NCAA has fumbled that. Because that's a natural right. Otherwise, there is no natural or statutory right to play. Pardon me?
The underlying right of the media rights, right?
I'm sorry. Well,
the name and likeness of the student athlete is the crux of the media rights.
If you're using them to advertise the sport, yes. If you're using it, if they have
they're
an
being
opportunity
paid. The media rights are paid for. It's not a news coverage event. They're being paid for. They're being told when to schedule their games.
Okay, but that's not the individual athlete.
But I'm saying their name and likeness rights have to convey through to the person who's distributing the content. And what I'm saying is that's shaky legal ground. That's pretty. Again, I'm in the business of having to acquire name and likeness rights, and pushing that through to the end distributor.
But you don't.
I don't think the courts are going to look at that and think it's a fair.
But you're not dealing with education mission.
Right. No, I understand.
That's the differentiator.
Yeah,
I don't want to take over all of the time, but the point I was making, though, but I mean, how much more can we do with regard to student athlete voices and impact. And I think that's an important point to be made.
That was a very interesting exchange. I, for a moment, thought maybe I'd need a referee's whistle there. But helpful, very helpful. Nancy, did you want to weigh in on Len's comments?
I was just going to say that, Len, you mentioned that how do you do this? We've already got the framework in terms of what the NCAA was able to do in terms of paying for families to go to the college football playoff and the NCAA tournament. And you mentioned that that's not talked about, and it is. Once things like that are done, as media members, we do write about it. We do talk about it, not every single day because there are, other issues that are pressing. But but if the NCAA or a power conference says we are going to expand our health care so that for the next 10 years after graduation or 5 years or whatever it is, we will write about it. We will cover it. I mean, I know that the Pac-12 does that simply because I've written about it before. So if those moves are made, they will get attention. But right now, the balance is so lopsided that the attention is on
But
what
see, that's the
athletes aren't getting.
editorial. That's the editorial comment that they're lopsided. To whom? As you as a writer, and you're entitled to your opinion. But let's place everything out there because once again, it's not getting through to the public.
Well, I think part of the problem, though, is that people are looking at Nick Saban making $11 million. The NCAA contract pays, the men's basketball tournament will ultimately pay, $1 billion a year. And then you see these kids who are, yes, they're getting an education.
Where does that money go? I just said it before, that $1 billion a year, where does that money go?
But you're still talking about the kids who are making those $1 billion possible. They're not getting...
If those kids aren't there, somebody is going to do it because it's about the name on the front, not the name on the back.
That doesn't necessarily make it right, though.
No, I didn't say it was right. But, I mean, that's what you sign up for when you know you are a beneficiary and you have an option. If you don't like those things, don't come to college to play basketball.
But that's
Go to the G League.
That's also somewhat a little disingenuous. I mean, how many kids really actually do make it out of the D League? How easy is it for kids to go over in Europe and play? And for football, you don't have an option.
Well, like David would say, that's your best bet. Your best bet is to come to college. If you're not going to make it, you can make it in something else. My point is it's an opportunity.
And I don't disagree with
for
that.
benefactors, but to say that it's unfair, that's almost tantamount to the usage that people have sometimes of analogizing this to slavery and indentured servitude. That's an insult. And to say this is unfair, to get a free education just because somebody's making a lot of money, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be a law school graduate. I wouldn't have been a lawyer without that opportunity for free education. And I only got $15 a month laundry money, and even though we weren't as popular as they are today, we still made money for the NCAA. Instead of talking about fair value for these kids, how about valuing education fairly? And that's all I'm talking about. And I like I said, I promised to shut up before, but I promise I will.
Several people lined up, Paul, and then Walt, and then Bud.
Before you do that, can I just have a little bit of input on this last conversation?
Absolutely.
If one of the things I've learned in my 4 years now as the athletic director is it's very, very complex. And so when you're looking at what is right and fair for the football players and very frankly the men's basketball players who end up producing what some people have perceived as these billions and billions of dollars. And to Lynn's point, where is that then reinvested? Well, it's reinvested in supporting all the other sports that we're trying to support. And so when you have discussions like, well, and the Pac-12 is a leader in this, and I'm very proud to be a part of the Pac-12 in terms of continuing scholarship guarantees, continuing health guarantees, time demand pluses. But when you get into questions that now bring into what is equitable, and so if in fact you bring families of all the NFL, all the college football championship teams who are going to their bowl games, and you bring in families of all the basketball families that go to the playoffs, then the question becomes, Are you going to invite the sand volleyball player families and pay for them to come to championships in track and field, in softball, in baseball, in lacrosse? And then you get in that point where, you know what? That's a real expensive proposition because Title IX and others will force you to consider doing those things. And those unintended consequences, if you go to the professionalization route, as some of the media often recommends, the effect on those other sports will be dramatic. And a lot of them will go away because you can't sustain that model. And so, well, if the men's basketball teams and the football teams always gets to charter, well then, should all of the teams be able to charter for time demand purposes? And the expense of doing all that will make it such that our collegiate system as we know it today will probably go away. And then you got to make the decision in your mind, do you want that to happen?
Thank you.
We've spent a lot of time here in the last 2 days talking about a number of issues that involve the intersection between professional sports and amateur sports, youth sports, and collegiate sports, professional sports. And I've been involved at all three levels for about almost 70 years. But I have a question I'd like any one of the panelists or all of the panelists to address. Should there be a greater level of dialogue and collaboration between the professional leagues and the governing bodies of collegiate and youth sports, perhaps starting with health and safety, and maybe if a dialogue and collaboration develops in that area, it might even extend to other areas such as facilities. And I'd be interested in different points of view because I don't know what the answer to that is myself. I'm schizophrenic.
I have immediate experience on that. I've become a little more active with the NFL Players Association. They have a media company now, so I do business with them media-wise. But I have, before I chose to share my story with the New York Times, I did a deep dive with the NFLPA on the science and what was happening in the NFL with safety, what was the real data. And Paul, I think that would go a long way in helping some of the youth sports because the NFLPA, my experience, very smart, what we're talking about, very well represented. And their entire focus is on the life, health, and safety of the players. That's it. They're a professional organization dedicated to life, health, and especially off-the-field success as well. And so, yeah, I think having those organizations involved, you know, the NFL is involved with heads-up tackling, with USA Football, so you've seen a little bit of that crossover. But I think that'd be a great idea is to bring the Major League Baseball, NHL, and NBA PA, the NFL PA, which is a very well-heeled organization with their licensing revenue. I think that'd be a huge help. And maybe hear from Bob to hear if that could help influence what you guys do.
Well, first of all, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that located next door to the NCAA, we had a wonderful working relationship with the NCAA. With their competitive safeguards committee, they have representatives who sit on our sports medicine advisory committee, and so there's been a real sharing that's been very beneficial to the high school community, and we know under President Emmert and with Dr. Hainline's work that will continue, and so we're appreciative of that. We have worked very closely with the NFL. As well as it related through USA Football. And during your commissionership, that got its start, and I've been privileged to be a part of that. And so that's been also very beneficial. We think we've gotten a lot of good material from that as well. Probably not as much in the other sports. And so that would be something the high school community would look forward to.
I was always reluctant to get too involved because I think the different interests and the different goals and purposes of the different levels of sport are rather dramatic. So I'm really interested in knowing how much further the envelope should be pushed in terms of the professional leagues or professional associations supporting youth sports, maybe in particular. Because I feel that youth sports are really threatened with funding challenges that are extraordinary because of anti-tax sentiment and lots of other developments in our society.
I think there are two other things to consider too. You know, one of the things that we've noticed with all of the talk about the drop in football participation numbers is you see and we see the same thing with baseball, it's a pipeline. If you don't have the kids playing at the youth level, if you don't have them playing at high school, they're not going to be playing in college. They're not going to be playing in the professional. So you do have to have a strong base at every single level. And, you know, if you're the NFL or the NBA, you can say, well, what do I care about an 8-year-old kid? That 8-year-old kid is eventually going to be your professional. So you should be concerned about their development. And one of the other things that, you know, we touched on a little bit, but the specialization that's occurring now. I mean, all of you who are involved in athletics, I'm guessing that you didn't just play one sport growing up. And we're seeing too much of it, I would argue, now. And I think if you have the voices of people from the NFL, from Major League Baseball, from the NBA, from the WNBA saying, no, you know, go play softball and basketball and field hockey or whatever, you know, tiddlywinks if you want to. It will help you in your athletic, you know, it will help you, it will benefit you as an athlete. It will also benefit you as a person. And I think that that can be a really strong message if you have the leagues or people who are in the leagues saying that.
So this is theoretically a panel on football, so I want to ask what I think is the elephant in the room question about football. Can we save the sport? Given what we know about the health dangers of playing football at any level, what are the, I'm not asking for a specific set of rules or specific kinds of equipment, but do we have a pathway to as people who support football, who have football teams, so that those of us who lead universities can say, I feel I can go to bed at night sleeping well because I think those student athletes are going to be well treated. What are some general areas we need to concentrate on?
You want to? It's a really tricky question, I think. You know, and it is the crux of sort of the safety issue here. We've been talking a lot about the business. There have been changes. I think there still need to be changes, especially on, you know, we talk a lot about, and when you watch the game, you tend to focus just on the ball. So that's where you see these great impacts and everything. But away from the ball, if you've studied the game, there is a lot of contact going on away from the ball. And anytime I would take people who are around the game into the film room and show them on a board on a, you know, giant screen what was happening on the backside of a play while the receiver was running up that side, they're all just shocked. Like, wait a minute. There's 3 guys fully engaged in a fist fight back behind the play. And as a player, I can tell you the helmet is weaponized. We talk a lot about technology in this game. The helmet is draconian. It is absolutely used. If you were in a fist fight and I had a helmet on, I would headbutt you with it. And that's what you end up doing. I would block guys, I would engage them. It was called 3 points, here, here, when I engage someone. That's your frontal lobe. And until we completely change techniques, and I give Pete Carroll of the Seahawks a lot of credit. He released a video on, I mentioned the rugby tackling earlier. That is a huge leap forward. And, you know, think about an old school coach releasing technique video. It just would never happen. And so there are people at the highest level, the NFL, that are asking to change it. I will say, Walt, I don't know. I mean, these guys are huge. If you're involved in college athletics and you have the ability to go down onto a practice field during a live contact practice, go do it. And don't talk on your phone, don't talk to your friend, don't talk to the SID who's in your hip pocket wanting to know something. Go stand right, have a line of scrimmage session right here. It'll blow your mind. It will blow your mind. It is a level of energy that's sort of hard to describe. So I don't know the answer, Walt.
Steve, I think it'd be helpful if you responded here as well. It's right down your
Great, thank
alley.
you. Yes, I believe this sport can survive. I think it's going to change. The sport has changed since its inception in 1900. The NCAA exists because the sport had to change, and it will continue to change. Rules changes, we've moved the kickoff line, there's different ways that we can engage, the flying wedge has been eliminated, all those things. To your comment, we don't know the long-term effects of concussion or repeated head impacts without concussion or with concussion. There's a series of cases that have been reported. They are cases, which is an important foundation to the scientific process, but it does not mean that everybody that ever played the sport or whoever got hit in the head, soccer, hockey, football, is going to end up with this disease. We don't know who gets it and why. And I would even argue further that the majority of the cases that have been published are from former professional athletes, football athletes, which is 0.01% of high school football players. It is a very small percent, not that they shouldn't be ignored. It is a very small percentage of the population that plays the game. So how do we change it? These are my thoughts. I have no evidence to give it up. Do we get rid of the three-point stance? Maybe. Do we develop better helmets? I don't think the helmet is draconian. I think the helmet's better than it's ever been, but it does give this safety net to players. It is comfortable to hit somebody head to head. Do we get rid of the helmet? No, because that's why we had helmets in the first place. So we had skull fractures and death on the field. We know we don't want to go back to that. We're not going to get rid of the helmet. We're not going to get rid of the face mask, but we can improve the helmet. People are looking at better turf, for that matter. But I think all of these are, the game will evolve, and people smarter than me, we have engineers at Michigan, and we have physical medicine rehab physicians at Michigan and around the country, Virginia Tech, North Carolina, doing incredible work in this field. But it takes time for this to happen. But the bottom line is, until we really understand the long-term effects, I mean, let's be honest, that's why we're talking about this, is because we're all worried about long-term effects. Until we really understand that, and that takes a 20 or 30-year longitudinal study, sorry. I'm 43, I'll still be around, I hope. Right? All right. I'll let you know what it's like on the other side. But that's what it's going to take, right? We did not know anything about the heart until the Framingham study came in. And let's be honest, I'm sorry to the cardiologist in the room, but the heart's a pump, it's easy. And it took 3 generations to figure it out. The brain is a lot more complex. And we're just at the forefront.
We have several people lined up, and we're bumping up against a time deadline. So I've got Bud and Scott and Val and Arnie. I'm not sure I'm going to get you all in, but let's give it a try.
So I'll just make a quick comment. I know we're short on time, and so I'm a little hesitant to do this, but I want to come back to the conversation between Lan and Ed. And just state that the NCAA has made tremendous progress in the last several years in terms of student-athlete representation in the governance process. Those changes where student-athletes are actually part of the governance process and participating in both the NCAA and the A5 levels have led to some of what I think are the most significant changes that have been made in some time. Things like the guaranteed 4-year scholarship, full cost of nutrition, and now the time demands on student athletes that's under discussion. But when I listened, Ed, to you and Lynn in your conversation, the thing that comes to mind is, and the difference I think I see is that in one case we're talking about individual input, and in the other we're talking about collective bargaining. And when you go to collective bargaining, the next step is employees. And I think that's the issue that's kind of behind this. If the student athletes are employees, then collective bargaining is certainly appropriate. If they're not, then perhaps not.
Just real quick, I was using that as sort of the process, not the let's collective bargain. I mean, if the athletes are there, also allow them to have representation. And so when you go to a meeting, they get to go. I understand what you're saying. Just to clarify, I meant that more as sort of the framework for how to move ahead.
Right, and that's why I started the way I did, because I think that we are in a position or a movement towards providing opportunities for student-athlete participation.
And thank you for that. It's been a long time coming, as you know.
I'd like to take a moment just to put this in a little larger context, building off a comment Ray said. I'm a former university president for many years. When we talk about intercollegiate athletics, it is simply one slice of the entire part of our institution. With the exception maybe of, depending on the year, 12 or 15 institutions in America, we're all losing money. We're supporting it by student fees, by not giving faculty members raises, by not supporting our academic mission. Yet our entire focus is on how do we reward, and I don't want to dismiss the importance, I was a former student athlete myself. How do we focus, you're focusing on one aspect of the larger mission of the higher education and losing sight of anything we do has repercussions, not just for the elite athletes who are sacrificing, but for the entire institution. How could I go back to a faculty and say to them, Ray, you focused on it will hurt the Olympic sports. It will. I'm worried about the rest of the institution. Where are the resources going to come from? They're not there. No one's making money off of athletics other than perhaps a few schools when it's fully costed. So when you talk about equity and fairness and supporting, if you will, diversity in our institutions, that money that you want to spend for a few could be used, quite honestly, for lots of other initiatives in our institutions that are far more important than athletics. How is it that you reconcile this in your minds when you talk about this subject? You could not talk about this absent the symptomatic or systemic impact it has on an entire institution. Where does that ever come into the dialogue? I'd like to know.
I guess I'm a little confused because I don't think that the money should just go to benefit the athletes. I do think that the athletic department needs to be more integrated or more holistic, if you will, to the entire institution. My experience at the University of Washington was an A+. I got everything. I got a great education. I met great people that have become lifelong friends and part of my network, business relationships. So I don't think that there is an or there. I think it can be an and. I really think it can be an and. And my final kind of thought here is, this is a bubble. We're in a bubble. You know, it's amazing that you say 12 or 15 schools are making money and everybody else is losing. That's a financial bubble. That means that there's an inefficiency in the market. And maybe it's time for this to pull back a little bit. You know, NCAA football now, you have to play 15 games to win a national championship. 15 games to win a national championship. I had to play 12 back in the early 90s. So, you know, maybe there's some contraction that can happen where it gets back more to the general vision of the university. Because you know, honestly, it's like a boil. It's so freaking talked about and big, and that's what the focus becomes, you know?
This contraction, we never talk about that. We play 12 games. Why do we have to play 12 games? Why can't we play 10 games? Would that not help the student athlete? And of course, we know why we play 12 games, because it's more money. So, you know, I think we get so singularly focused on this issue now about the athletes and paying them, and not that they're not deserving of many things, especially health and welfare. But boy, I'll tell you, I think there's larger things at stake than intercollegiate athletics when we have this conversation. It's our institutions, because you only have so many dollars, and how you allocate those dollars. And quite honestly, we're best serving all of our students, including our athletes, if we're investing in high-quality education first. That's how they're going to benefit from it. So somehow in this dialogue, I'd like to see more of that discussion.
I'm going to let Bud have the last word. Actually, I'm going to have the last word after you, but
Good. I didn't want the last word. I just want to clarify, Scott. You say that most of the programs are losing money. They are investing money, but we do not operate intercollegiate athletics at Georgia Tech on a profit. But we also provide an incredible opportunity for 385 scholarship student athletes to attend, and that's an investment that we're making in their future and opportunities for them.
What about the other 15,000 students you have there and faculty there who may not be getting raises, or you can't do something academically because you're reallocating those assets to 365? You don't have, I know this is an endless argument.
We'll talk at lunch.
Actually, I got to catch your plane.
so I know that there are a number of people who still have questions. It's been a very, very interesting panel. Thank you for your different perspectives, for your willingness to kind of get in and mix it up a little bit. Made it very, very interesting for all of us and gave us a lot to think about. So huge thank you to our 5 panelists. And we are going to take a very short break, but reconvene at noon sharp.